Okay, welcome. This is going to be a presentation on how to use pro formas for affordable housing preservation. So we're going to do a foundational overview of the concepts that make up a pro forma, and then we're going to talk about how it's used as a tool to inform your process of considering acquiring a building or not. So the pro forma is essentially a spreadsheet that helps you assess both year-to-year budgets for a building and think about, is this building going to have enough rental income to cover the expenses we can anticipate? And then it also looks at the one-time cost of the actual acquisition itself. So we'll get into it in a little bit. I want to start with this disclaimer, which I'm just going to put up for a moment for your consideration. Okay, thank you for that. And then let me just briefly say that San Francisco Community Land Trust, which is the organization that's created all of these presentations, we were formed in 2003 to fight displacement pressures that were happening and still happening in San Francisco. We currently have 16 buildings with roughly 180 units of permanently affordable housing. All of our properties are located in San Francisco, and we also currently lend technical support to other CLTs that are located across the Bay Area. I am Victoria Beckley. I am our finance director at SFCLT. So thanks for joining. So quick agenda. I'm going to touch on 5 major elements of the pro forma. So first we'll talk about the acquisition budget. So what are the sources and the uses? What are our costs for purchasing this building? And what are our funding sources for that purchase? We'll talk then about the annual budget. So every year, what are the expenses we expect for this building? What is our income, which is just essentially rents being paid to us by the tenants? And then we'll get into capital needs. What are the long-term needs that this building will have for us to maintain it in a healthy and safe condition for residents? We'll talk about a capital needs assessment, and we'll talk about how we have reserves set aside that allow us to fund those needs over the 20 years that we're projecting. And then fourth, we'll talk about using this as an actual tool to understand first, what kind of loans can this project handle? How big of a loan can this building handle given its rents and its expenses? We'll look at these 2 really key numbers, the NOI and the DSCR, to talk about how you size a loan using this tool. And then we'll talk more generally about how it can be used for decision making. The kind of eternal question of, does this project pencil, meaning is it financially sustainable, looking into the future? And then what kind of adjustments can we make to the pro forma to try to get it there if it's not there yet? Okay, so let's get right into it. So first we have the acquisition budget. So I like to think of this as the one-time cost. You know, the annual budget, that's going to be every year recurring cost. But the acquisition budget is just one-time cost. How much money do we need to purchase this building while also meeting all of these other requirements that are common with public funding sources? So we use these terms, sources and uses. That's kind of always how they're said. I'm going to talk first about uses. And so that is just going to be the cost that we have for acquiring the building. Anytime I've bolded one of them, it's because it's by far the most expensive. So the acquisition cost, you know, for an acquisition rehab project, this should be your highest cost. I guess you could get a building for super cheap, but it's common for it to be the biggest expense. So this is just the sale price. And then the hard cost is the term that we use to talk about any sort of, we call it rehab, which just means renovations that need to happen to the building in order to get it to be a safe and healthy condition for the residents, as oftentimes these buildings are not. So it's just our construction cost upon acquisition. And then we've got our soft costs. This can be all kinds of things. And I'll show this spreadsheet in a second so you can look at some examples. But more or less, it's going to be things like the design costs, permit fees, inspections, surveys, assessments, all kinds of stuff. And then we've also got the reserves. So I touched on this a little bit. The reserves are going to be those set aside bank accounts that we have that are set up to help us fund things that need to be funded. So we have the replacement reserve that helps with the building condition, the operating reserve, it's about operations. We'll talk about that in a second. And so, I just want to show you on the right here, I pulled numbers from our current acquisition that we are so soon to close on. And just want to give you an example. We've got this 6-unit building. So it's 5 residential units and 1 commercial unit. That's pretty common for us here in San Francisco. The acquisition price is 1.5 million. The hard cost is also quite high. One of the things we have to do is upgrade the electrical immediately upon acquiring it. So a lot of that rehab cost, it can be quite expensive. So that's $700K. The soft cost, and I'll show examples in a second, is $375K, with 165 of that being the developer's fee, which I'll describe momentarily. And then for the replacement reserve, we were lucky in that we got it quite seriously funded. So it starts at 400,000 because the long-term needs for this building are 2 million. So, and I'll show you an example of how we got to that $2 million number here later on. Before I go to the spreadsheet, let me just touch on sources, as this is the other half of the sources and uses. And this is just simply our funding sources, right? So these projects are almost always going to have multiple funding sources. And we need to have these laid out in the pro forma in order for us to, reconcile these things together. So it can be government funding. A lot of our projects are soft debt from the city. You could have CDFI or bank loans. Those are going to be hard debt that you do need to pay back. You can have donations, equity, grants, and then et cetera. There's always more. So let's take a moment and jump over to our spreadsheet and just talk through some of these sources and uses. So this example will be shared for you to access if you would like. But the way that I like to lay it out here is up top, we've got our sources. And so I like to say, what is the debt type? This is the hard debt that the city of San Francisco gives to us. I want to put down what the interest rate is here because it's relevant, and the loan term and the amortization period. We've also got our soft debt here. These numbers aren't so important here, so I don't include them. If we've got organization equity we're putting into it, other equity investments, philanthropy, we'll have those all here. Lucky for us, we actually just need these 2 funding sources. So it's pretty simple. Okay, and now into the uses. This can be broken down a lot of different ways, but this is a pretty common breakdown. We talk about our acquisition cost. So this is a different example than the one I just showed you. So this building was $2.7 million. We've got a little bit of additional cost there, which is the closing cost. So altogether, here's our total acquisition cost. And then we've got the construction or the hard cost, right? So this one doesn't have any. That's too bad. But typically this would be, $400K or something like that. And then you see these other things are populated based on that. And if you look at this spreadsheet, because you're actually trying to work on this on your own, you'll see that there's notes in this column that are really, really helpful. So it explains, okay, this one is based on 5% of the rehab. The GC overhead and profit is based on 15% of the rehab. And then this is something you'll see a lot, is this contingency. So this is just an additional 15% that we're padding in there in case things are more expensive than we expect. So altogether, our hard cost, I just made this up, but they're 450K or 540K. Okay, and then soft cost. I find it really helpful to actually look at this list to wrap your head around it, because these can be so many different things. I'll come back to this guy in a second, but we've got, just design, architectural fees. If we're doing some sort of rehab that involves needing to have those, construction manager, the physical needs assessment or the capital needs assessment is we hire someone to do that for us. I'll show you an example of one of those later. We have to get an appraisal, that costs money. There's other tests and inspections that the city is requiring us to do based on the loan they're giving us. So we do those. There's loan origination fees from the city. There's a bunch of different stuff, right? We don't have a transfer tax in SF, but lots of other places do. Okay, a couple to actually dig into. Property taxes. So because we're a nonprofit, we are going to apply for property tax exemption. It's called the welfare tax exemption. However, as my note says here, this is for the time before we get approved for the exemption, because we do have to pay property taxes up until that point. They'll get reimbursed, but we want to get that payment. We want to account for that payment that we'll have to make. So we use an 18-month period, and then we just use the actual property tax percentage that we have in San Francisco. So that's how that's calculated. And then something that this project, again, it's a fictional project, but doesn't have is relocation costs. But this is very common as a need when buildings have units that need a lot of renovations. We have to relocate the tenants, and we need to pay for their new rent at the place we're putting them up at, and we need to also pay for moving expenses. So here I've said this might be a little high, but we calculate as $4,500 per move per unit, and then also the monthly rent at the new place for 6 months. So this amount can be really quite massive. And the other one I want to touch on is the developer fee, which is a very important part of this whole process. So this is how we pay ourselves for the time to do this development. It's common that you'll get a first chunk upon closing and then a second chunk upon completing the rehab. And so for this one, it's calculated as San Francisco allows you to do 100K for the closing and then 10K per unit for the rehab. So that's how we get to 165. If you're using city funding, they'll all be different. But here's just the example for us. Okay, you'll see we also have a 15% contingency on the soft cost. And that brings our total soft cost to 400K. Okay, and so then we've got our reserves. And so the replacement reserve is the money that's set aside for those physical needs that the building will have over 20 years. These could be a new roof, the units getting rehabbed. I mean, it can be all kinds of stuff. It's not going to include the initial rehab upon acquisition, but it's going to be anything after that. We're always trying to get this number to be larger because our buildings tend to be undercapitalized because of the restrictions that the city has. So here 100K is probably not enough, but it's a starting point. And then we also have our operating reserves. So these are really just intended to be a cushion in case our expenses are unusually high one year, like our insurance rates increase or the elevator needed to be repaired. And so then we have this as an infusion of money to make it so the building still cash flows. Vacancy reserve. Okay, so this also is lucky for this hypothetical building in which we don't have any vacant units. But if you do have vacant units, it's smart to set aside 6 months worth of rent as a vacancy reserve here, assuming it'll take you 6 months to fill those units, especially if you have to rehab them, it could be even longer. So that's where we put that amount. Okay, thank you for sticking with me through that. I know that was a lot of information. And so that is the basic overview of the acquisition budget, the sources and uses. Okay, now we're going into the annual budget. So these are the recurring costs. I referred to one just a moment ago, insurance costs, for example. So here we will call them expenses and we will call them income. So expenses, these are the things that you just think of that any building needs to have, right? So it has to have property insurance. We will have some utility payments we have to make. We outsource our property management, so we will have to pay our property managers every month. Any repairs that need to be made, right? So this is different than the capital needs stuff we've been talking about. Those are the planned expenses. But repairs, things that have to be fixed in the moment, for an example, in an elevator, someone's got a leak, any of those kind of typical home repairs you can think of, those are going to come out of our expenses in the annual budget. And we're going to estimate an amount every year we do it based on our portfolio. And then I've bolded loan payments because this is the biggest one. It's a little confusing to include it here because later I'm going to talk about it separately, but we have to talk about how paying the debt on our loans is the largest expense. I mean, potentially for us, it's typically the largest expense we have for any building. Okay, so those are expenses. We'll look at a spreadsheet. We'll get the details there in a second. And then income is just the term we use to talk about rents, more or less. There's some other kinds of income. There's laundry, there's parking, storage. If anyone's paying those on a monthly basis, that's also part of the income. If you have commercial units, there's commercial rents, but income is more or less rents. And I always say with quotation marks because it just feels like it's too disconnected from reality that people are paying us these rents. Okay, so these are our recurring costs. Let's go look at what that looks like in the pro forma. So here I've called the tab pro forma. Other times I'll call it 20-year cash flow. That's kind of common. All right, so let's get into it. Here we go. We've got our rents. I guess I should just briefly show you. We do have the rent roll tab. This is pretty common. So it's nice just to have a tab that shows you your units. We've got these 6 units. And this is a building we were going to acquire, to be clear, but and it does have 2 vacancies. So boy, the vacancy reserve was incorrect a moment ago, but just stick with me. We've got these 6 units and here's their current rent. And then here's the estimated rent because we're going to fill the 2 vacant units. That's a lot, but it is a 2-bedroom in San Francisco. And I think that's below market value. Okay. And so then I've got every single year, I've got our rents here. And then what's notable here is that they increase over time using our annual rent increase. So this number is set by the city of San Francisco. And so that's the number that we see these increasing. We can advocate for this to be lower if we need to, if someone's really low income, but I'm not going to get into that right now. This is just the simple way we show it stretched out over 20 years. Okay, so then we get that total amount for the year for all of our units. Ooh, and so that comes in here, boom. Here's a couple things. We're getting in the weeds, but it's important to touch on. Vacancy is another cushion that we build in, and that is common and oftentimes will be required from your government lender. And this is just anticipating that units are going to become vacant throughout the year, and we want a little bit of cushion. So we expect 5% of rents won't be paid because those units will be vacant. And then bad debt is the interesting term we use to refer to people just when people are unable to pay their rent. And so these are both 5% cushions. You could make it larger, you could split them out, whatever. But it's typical for us to do kind of 10% combined for vacancy and bad debt. So those are subtracted, right? And then other income, that's, I guess there's a parking space. That could be laundry, for example. So there's our total income for the building. And here's we've got operating expenses. And luckily I've done this thing, which I meant to do for too long, which is actually just put in what our portfolio averages are here on the left. Really helpful. This little expression stands for per unit per month or per unit per year, per annual, right? So that helps you understand how to multiply it. Okay, so here are some really classic expenses that you'll have for a building. Staffing. We got to pay property management. We pay ourselves an asset management fee. We have legal expenses and advertising and leasing when units are free. I don't know why. Oh, it's 0 because we have a staff person that does it. Okay. Utilities. So for many buildings, you'll pay all of these. When I write OM right here, this means look to the offering memorandum for this number. So that's the document that comes out when if a building is put on the market, it will be put out with the listing, and that will say what the current owner pays for electricity and gas. And you can just use that number, maybe increase it for inflation, and hope that it's correct. All right, annual fees, property and liability insurance. Yeah, that's huge. So right now, our typical unit is costing us $1,700 a year in property insurance. And so you can just see this number simply takes that number, multiplies it by the number of units, and gives us 10,000 a year for that. Cool. Bookkeeping and auditing. Then we've got building upkeep. So this is just responding to needs that are not anticipated, but just come up, right? So we've got to have the janitor come in sometimes and clean things up. Maintenance and repair. This is usually a pretty big expense. Pest control. This happens periodically. We account for it. Elevator only if there's an elevator, which this building, I think it does have one. The replacement reserves, so we have to put money into the replacement reserves every year. So we do $400 per unit per year. Saying no CD here is not very useful. And then property taxes. So, right, this is the property taxes after the initial period. And so we still end up paying some residual property taxes, especially if we have a commercial unit. So those are accounted for there. Miscellaneous, bond monitoring fees. This is, charged by the city for their soft debt, licensing permits, and miscellaneous. Okay, thank you for bearing with me through that. That was kind of deep in the weeds, but just to give you a sense of what these expenses entail, because this is so much of what putting these documents together is about. It's like, ooh, is our insurance estimate correct? Oh, why is the water bill so high versus the previous year for the previous owner? It's just like trying to refine these things so that you can then do all the other estimates that we're about to talk about. Okay, so we're going to pause there on the spreadsheet, income and expenses. One last thing is we do draw this out over 20 years as well, because we're trying to think about this in 20-year periods. And we do have expenses increasing at a 3% rate. So it's notable that the rent's increasing at 2.5, the expenses are increasing at 3. Doesn't seem ideal, but that's what's happening here. Okay. Back over here, capital needs. Okay, this is exciting, I think. So when we acquire a building, we have a capital needs assessment done on the building before we close on it. It's another requirement by the city, but it's extremely helpful for us because what this company does is they go and they look at the building, they assess it, and they document everything that will need to be repaired over the next 20 years, or just actually indefinitely. But they tell us how much life is left in that thing. Maybe it's a window, maybe it's a door, maybe it's a stove in a unit. They say, this is how much life this thing has. And so you need to anticipate repairing it in 2028, and I'll show you the spreadsheet so you can actually wrap your head around it. But they check out the whole building and they give us this amazing document that estimates the needs over 20 years. And so this is that expected needs. Sometimes they're called capital expenditures, CapEx, right? So these are those things that we're anticipating, and they maintain the quality and the value of the building over time. And so the way that we pay for these things is by way of the replacement reserve, which I talked about earlier. This is just a bank account that we set aside with funding. Ideally, it has funding upon acquiring the building. And then this, which we then deposit more money into every year. This is what allows us to have those expensive repairs, these, a new roof that needs to get done in 10 years, replace all of the windows, which needs to happen in 15 years. This is what funds those big projects. And I'll show you the spreadsheet in a second. Let me just touch on operating reserves and vacancy reserves. I actually kind of touched on both of them, but I'll just say operating reserves, that is calculated using 15% of the total first year operating expenses. That's how we fund the initial operating reserve. And then we pull out of that when we have unexpected expenses. And then the vacancy reserve, as I said, it's 6 months rent for the vacant units. Okay, cool. So let's look at a CNA. We're actually going to go to this pro forma for it. Okay, so this document is pretty sweet. This is just sent to me by the organization that does our CNA. I didn't create it at all. I just copy and pasted it in here, and then I'll show you how I connect it to the pro forma. So they go through and they say, here's everything that might need to get repaired in the exterior common areas. Here's everything in the interior common areas. Unit 1, this is what needs to get changed. Unit 2, boom. And then what's great, I mean, maybe this is normal to everyone else, but I think it's so impressive, is it has an estimated use life and a remaining use life for each of these items. So like the mailboxes, those should last for 20 years. Those mailboxes only have 3 years left on them. And here's how much we expect it to cost. So you know what happens? We scroll over in year 3, boom, we're getting new mailboxes. We're paying for them in year 3. What else are we paying for in year 3? Hydrojetting. I don't do any of our construction stuff, so I have, no idea what that means, but it sounds exciting. The carpet's getting replaced in the interior common area, and that costs $12,000, and that's happening in year 3, right? So this is where we get all of the needs assessed and written in here. Typically, there will also be immediate needs here. This is our rehab cost. I can't tell you why they're not here. A couple other things I just want to point out while we're looking at this. So, you're looking at it year to year, and we see in year 3, the estimate is that the cost will be $36,000 for all of these various repairs. A lot of wall heaters getting put in place. But then also, because this is in the future, we add inflation. Obvious to do, but just seems really brilliant to me. So you'll see this is now the inflated price. So it's accounting for 3 years from now. If we expect 2% inflation, which is perhaps incorrect, it'll cost this much. Okay, so that's the number we actually use when it comes to like, what do we need to do in 2030? Oh, we need to do $123,000 worth of work. Let's make sure we have that much in our reserves to cover it. And then we can see at the end of this 20-year period, kind of low, honestly. This is really very low compared to the other building I was talking about, which had a $2 million need after 20 years. Okay, so let me just show you how this plugs in. So we're going to go to, this one's called the 20-year cash flow. So we've got our income up here, our expenses here. We're scrolling past all this, which we'll talk about in a moment. And here we have, this is where we account for the replacement reserve, how it changes over time based on those needs. So this is the amount we started with. That was just what was initially put into this bank account for us to do these repairs with. And then the withdrawals, this actually comes from the CNA, right? So there's the 123,000 in year 5, and so on and so forth. And so what's really important to us here as we're assessing all of this information we've gotten is if our replacement reserve running balance stays positive. That's what we want to see. So let's just note that it becomes negative in year 15. So we'll circle back to that when we talk about decision making with the pro forma. Okay, we're cruising through this. Thank you for being in the weeds with me. I hope you're a technical person. And if not, hats off to you. Okay, so now we want to get to how we can actually use this tool to make sense of the information that we've put into it, right? It's nice to look at the information and see it all in the spreadsheet, but how can we actually use it to inform our decision making and understand what the long-term feasibility is for this building financially, right? So the first thing we're going to start with is using it to size a loan. So if you think of your typical, I'm sure you all know this, but just to say it, if you think of your typical home mortgage, it's common that there's a 20% requirement for the down payment, so that you can think of as your equity. And then there's 80% that can be used, that can be covered by a loan, right? So similarly with these acquisitions that we do, A portion of it will be covered by hard debt or a loan. We like to call it hard debt. And then a portion of it will have to be equity or soft debt from a government source. And so we want to be able to determine, based on what we've just looked at, the incomes, the expenses for this building, how much debt can it handle, right? So that's like the question, or that's the first question. So if we look to the table or the panel kind of on the right here, the question of how much debt can this project handle? So first, we're going to come up with this number called the NOI, the net operating income. This is simply the income, which is the rents, minus the expenses, okay? And here, the expenses are not including the payments on the loans. So earlier I talked about them together, but if you remember in the spreadsheet, when we listed the expenses, none of those included the loan payments. So that is actually usually thought of as separate. And so here, what we're going to do is we're going to take this NOI and we're going to compare it to that loan payment to see the DSCR, right? This is sort of like what the lenders want to know. So just to back up a second. So the annual loan payments is what we also like to call the debt service. That's kind of the most common way it's referred to. And so then we've got the debt service coverage ratio, right? So this is going to be the NOI divided by the debt service. And kind of understandably so, lenders and, everyone involved wants this NOI number to be notably larger than the debt service payment, right? Because if those are one-to-one and suddenly your expenses are up, then you're not doing well. The building is not cash flowing. So it's typical that the DSCR requirements will be 1.15 to 1.25. And I like to think of this as a percentage buffer, right? So essentially, you want your annual loan payments to be 15 to 25% less than the money that's left over after your expenses are covered, which is the money that you have available for paying this debt service, right? So hopefully that makes sense. This comes up truly constantly. So this is something you'll want to understand. Okay, I think there's a little typo there. So just refer to this here. And then one more thing I want to touch on before I show you what this looks like in the pro forma is this other term, which it comes up less often for CLTs, but is still very much industry jargon and useful to know, which is the cap rate. So this is the capitalization rate. This is very popular among investors, like private equity investors who are buying properties to make money, which is not what we're doing. But sometimes, government people or lenders might ask you about this. This number is simply the NOI divided by the current property value. So whatever that percentage is, say it's 4%, that would indicate that you are going to make a 4%, I'm putting this all in quotes, return on your investment each year. So just something to know. All right, let's look at the pro forma. So let's look at this one. Okay, so the first thing to note, right, we're talking about that, how much debt can the project handle? This is obviously a lot more complicated, what I'm showing you right now, than what we need to understand for this single calculation. But if we were to say, okay, what is the maximum loan size if we're using the DSCR and we're using a 1.151, which is arguably too low for what modern lenders are seeking? So what is that loan amount going to be? And so this is cool. You don't have to understand this equation, but I'll just show you. It's pulling in the NOI. It's pulling in the DSCR that we're required to meet. And it's also pulling in the very nice interest rate we can get from the city of San Francisco and the amortization period. And so then it's taking that and it's telling us, okay, this property, given what you've told us, can handle $1.18 million in hard debt. Okay, great. So the other number we want to note while we're on this page is the annual debt service. So this is just how much money we'd have to pay every year on that loan. And you can see it broken out here if you want more detail. But it's $66,000 a year. So now this number comes in here. Okay, so we've looked at our income, we've looked at our expenses. Here is our NOI, right? Makes sense. We're like 140 minus 62, we get 76. That's awesome. And so then now we've got that debt payment, and then what's left over is $10,000. But you know what? That's okay because I mean, it makes sense. This is 1.15 because that's what we put right here. But our DSCR is 1.15. So this is kind of the other way we see this number. It's either used to calculate how much loan your property can handle, or always it's used in the cash flow to show you, okay, at the end of each year, boom, here is our DSCR. And you want this number to be growing. If it's not growing, this building is not going to work. You know what I mean? Like you need this to be getting larger over time, or at least staying stable. So the reason that this is increasing over time, just to point it out, is because our debt service payments are consistent year to year. Unless we refinance the loan, this should stay the same unless we have a variable rate, which, don't do that. But what's changing is our NOI. So it's increasing over time, which is great. And the DSCR comes up with it, right? So that's awesome. Okay, and now we've made it to the final concept of the pro forma, which is how can we use this to make decisions? I've kind of touched on this, but let's get right to it, right? So this is the question that people in real estate will always be asking, and it is, does it pencil, right? And that just means, is this building going to be financially sustainable for the next 20 years? We're hoping it continues after 20, but we're only assessing it in a 20-year period. So I've identified kind of like the two ways to go about assessing this. There's kind of more than two, but these are just the basic yes, no's, right? So as we've discussed, does the income of the building cover the cost of the expenses and the debt service, right? And as we said, we want that DSCR. We don't want it to be 1 because that would be a perfect match of NOI to debt service. We want it to be higher than that. So does it cover the cost and does it have a little additional cushion is the question there. And then another question is, and are the reserves adequately funded to cover the needs? Because yeah, sure, you're breaking even every year. You've got that 15% cushion. You've got a little bit of residual money left over at the end. But you might need to pay that residual money to your soft debt lender. You might need to do something. You might not have a lot of things you can do with it, but maybe it needs to go somewhere else. And so you want to make sure that even while you're having this basic cash flow occur, where the money is left over at the end, you need to make sure that you also have a lot of replacement reserves set up to begin with, or else you won't be able to repair the roof at year 8. You won't be able to, rehab a unit when it turns over. Like you need to have those reserves set aside in order for the building to stay in a good condition, because that is an essential part of its sustainability, right? So let's just pop over to the spreadsheet. We're not doing thank you yet. And let's just think a little bit about those two questions. So, the way I've got it set up here, the hard debt's not going to be any larger than it can be because it's being calculated here using this DSCR. So this will always be at least 1.15, the way I've set it up, right? So there will be residual money left over, which is great because we have to pay the city back a tiny amount of money for the soft debt. But, the way that I would assess this here is I would say, okay, great. We know that the hard debt is not larger than what the project can handle, but are we actually covering the full cost of the project with the hard debt from the city as well as the soft debt from the city, which you'll see is like, 2 times as much? And the answer is no, we have a tiny financing gap, right? So we could try to get rid of this by bringing down our costs. This is something that no one ever wants me to do because, we can't just reduce the cost of construction. We need that money for the construction. We can't just reduce our expenses. We can try, but like insurance costs what it costs. So that's not an easy way to change it. We could maybe negotiate a lower interest rate with the city. That might reduce our cost, and then it might, no, but this is our initial cost. So it doesn't matter what we do to the expenses. This needs to be resolved here. And because I made up this number to begin with, I could reduce it. Obviously, this is not what you would do in real life. And then our financing gap. Oh, I see. It's positive. Never mind. Okay. So there is no financing gap on this project. But say this was higher, then we would have a gap. Okay. And so then we would have to say, is there anything we can do? I'm not going to go into this because it's not the point of this workshop, but there's a million things we can try to do, right? Many of which will upset your colleagues or yourself if you're the only staff member. But things like reducing the developer fee, right? This is money that we're paying ourselves. So we could say, all right, well, this project is so close to working, but we can't get any more sources. No one will donate to us. We've capped out all of the sort of grants we might be eligible for. But we could just give up the developer fee. We could take a portion of it. And then, well, that didn't fix it, but it got us closer. So you can do things like that. I don't really recommend it, but you can try to make little tweaks. You can do things to try to make this work. Yeah, I guess. Okay. Anyway, yeah, I guess if we were to decrease the interest rate, we could get a slightly larger loan. And I think that actually would cover our gap. Okay, cool. So there's a lot of different things you can look at. Some of them are realistic, some of them are not realistic. But those are the kinds of things you want to be assessing. Like, not only is there money left over at the end, but also are all of our expenses accounted for? Are all of our acquisition costs accounted for by the sources we have? And then our second question, the reserves. Right. Okay, so let's look at those. So we looked at this a little bit, right? Here's our reserve. We start with 100K. We'd like to start with more because we got a lot of expenses. Oh, this is not the one that has, okay. It's over here. Okay. So here we start with 243K, even better. And we've got our CNA annual withdrawals put in here. So we see we're doing okay, but then we have this 1 year with like a massive amount of needs. And then we dip into the negative in terms of our replacement reserve, which is not where we want to be. The good news here is that we're in year 15 of the loans. In this scenario, we have 2 loans, which I'm not going to go into the details of, but we're in year 15 of the loans, which means if we need more money for the reserves, which I'll just say is very common at year 15, we can refinance the loans. And so, especially here, we can see the junior debt, which is the second loan we make a payment on. This one needs to be at least 1.15 in our scenarios. And so now that it's up to 1.49, we do have a bit of a gap. And that means if we bring this back down to 1.15, it means that we can infuse, I don't know, a couple $100,000 more debt into the project, still keeping it at that level that a lender will approve of. And that might be just the amount that we need to fund the reserves for the remaining, 5 years here, but, future, we'd probably do another CNA at year 15. So into the future as well. So that's the other thing I always want to look at is, okay, maybe all these other numbers look good, but do we actually have enough replacement reserve for the full 20 years? And if not, is it possible to get, the city to give us more soft debt to cover that? Or is it possible that we have more room for more hard debt and we can take that on because the building is doing so well with how it's currently estimated, right? So this is an extremely iterative project or process. And as you're doing these pro formas, so-and-so will get back to you with the updated insurance estimate. So-and-so will get back to you with the updated rehab cost. Oh, we did this inspection. It turns out we have to replace all of the electrical system. That's going to be an additional 250K. Like, how can we make that work? So that's just like, this is the whole process of working with the pro forma to use it as a tool alongside considering a building for acquisition. So a couple of just other things that we talked about this, but these are preliminary assessments before it does a pencil, right? Is the hard debt meeting the DSCR requirements? I've got it set up where it has to, but you might have it coming at you a different way. And do the sources cover the uses? Very basic, but essential. Okay, so that is the conclusion of our presentation. Thank you for joining me and listening. I hope this was helpful. I also have an interactive workshop that I hosted where the participants actually work with that spreadsheet that I showed you. I have two workshops, actually one with each spreadsheet. So if you are interested in those, I can share them. It's definitely it's a good way to go into the next level of depth where you're like changing numbers yourself. You're making sense of how these things are connected. And I think that's really the best way to learn. So feel free to reach out to me or SFCLT at large to get access to those. And yeah, thank you so much.